This is Austin Liti Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Katie Gutierrez. Katie grew up in Laredo and went on to acquire a Master's of Fine Arts degree from Texas State University in San Marcos. She's been published by notable magazines like Time, Harper's Bazaar, and The Washington Post. More Than You'll Ever Know is her first novel, a Good Morning America book club pick, and it's been praised as a fantastic, sweeping novel.
Welcome to the show, Katie Gutierrez.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott.
Of course. So your excellent new book, More Than You'll Ever Know, it actually publishes tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
I've read quite a lot about this book and your experience with it, so I have a lot of questions. But The first question is, the main character, Lore, is a very deceitful person, although she has kind of an intriguing background.
Mm-hmm.
How did you wrestle with a character like her, such a deceptive type of person, besides just curiosity? How did you wrestle with that when you were writing her and developing her?
I always conceived of Lore as being a very unapologetic character. The type of character who is sort of unabashedly who she is, and that the way she would narrate the story would be very frank for the reader and I didn't want her to hide things from the reader. And in that way, I always imagined that she would be a very charming character, which becomes confusing for Cassie in particular, who doesn't necessarily anticipate liking Lore or forming any kind of intimate connection with her. And so I think in some ways she charmed me similarly to how she charmed the other characters. And, when I say charmed, I don't mean it in a superficial sense or even a purposely manipulative sense, but more so because she's so alive and because she wants to be even more alive. I think that she is a woman who has a lot of yearning, a lot of want, a lot of desire. She's in her early to mid 30s when the 80s chapters begin, and she's sort of entering into this new phase of life as a wife and as a mother. She is the primary earner for the family at this point in time. She has a lot of independence and authority with her career. She's needed less by her twin sons than she did, as they were growing up. And so she has a little bit more freedom there. And I think as she's entering into this new phase, it comes with this question of, who am I? Who am I now? I've spent the last 12 years completely kind of consumed by motherhood, even though she has worked for maybe half that time. But I think that she is feeling restless and this desire to discover who she is beneath these roles that she's created for herself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that I understand. It's something that it's something I relate to. And it's also something that I always admire about people and women in particular, when a woman can say, look at everything I have and it's good, but there's still more that I want. There's still more that's missing. And I don't know what it is, but I'm going to prioritize myself enough to find it and to think that that's important. And obviously the way she goes about it is, probably not the best way. But to me, the fact that she thinks she is worthy of such a pursuit is a very compelling quality in her character. And so I think all of those things made me like her very much, despite what she does. And it's also, I think as a writer, it's about not letting those extreme choices define her as a character, but also letting her make all these little small choices along the way and seeing these different nuances of her character. She's not this seductive siren of a woman who's out there having affairs all the time. She's an ordinary wife and mom and daughter and sister. And I wanted to show her in all of those very ordinary slices of her day as well.
Right. Yeah, both characters, Cassie and Lore, are very charismatic, and they're very full characters. So they both have these gray areas where it's easy to cross the line into something that's a little unseemly, right?
Right.
So when you were first developing these characters, did you think that you were going to have them be both of them equally well-rounded this way, or did it just kind of develop that way when the story kind of fleshed out?
I always wanted to have them both be sort of worthy adversaries, if you will. Not adversaries, but I wanted them to essentially be mirrors for each other in different ways throughout the story. And I think in order for that to work, Cassie had to be as well developed as Lore. I never wanted for Cassie to be sort of just this journalistic frame narrative around the main story. I thought that if that was what it ended up being, then I would have to just cut her entirely and focus on Lore, which there were a couple of times in the writing and editing process where I considered it, because really it was difficult getting Cassie up to that same level of complexity and nuance as Lore, just because Lore, I think, had the advantage of this very extreme story at the outset, which I think is compelling for a reader from the word go, whereas I think Cassie's story is a bit more subtle. And so I think that it took a lot of work from every aspect, from the character development aspect, but also kind of structurally in terms of, braiding the chapters together, watching how they play off each other, in order to make sure that a reader is not getting to one or the other and going, oh, back to this one, I can't wait to go back to the other one. That was something that I was I never wanted, a reader to experience. And it was definitely, it was a challenge, and an important challenge throughout, to make sure that both women were equally well-rounded.
Right. So do you remember that first little nugget that inspired the story? And what was that? And where were you in your life when that nugget kind of popped in your mind? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It was years ago. It was, I'm guessing around 2010 or 2011. I know I was still in the MFA program. I'm at Texas State. And at the time I was working on a collection of short stories, and they were all set in South Texas as well. And I came across this double life story. It had happened some years ago, so I'm not even sure how I encountered it. Just one of those internet things. And it was about a man who'd been married to his first wife for 50 plus years. They had 3 kids together. And then one night the wife passed away unexpectedly in her car in the garage. And 2 weeks later, he married somebody else. And everybody was like, well, who is this woman? And it turned out that he had been living this double life with her 20 miles down the road for the last 30 years. He'd fathered 2 kids with her.
Wow.
Yeah. He was a very wealthy man. And so he'd bought them the same Rolls Royce. He sent all 5 kids to the same elite prep school. The 2 women had served on the same school board, I think at the same time. So it was really fascinating, this idea of like the longevity of this lie, between these 2 women. The fact that everybody was so shocked from the outside looking in, nobody seemed to have any idea. It was the question of, how did he pull it off? Why did he let them get so close together? Why did he tempt fate by sending all his kids to the same school and having everyone be so close? And then I got curious about whether, because I think secret life stories are sort of inherently fascinating. And
of course, yeah.
At the time, I was like, well, you never hear about women doing this. And the answers are pretty obvious as to why not. It's a lot harder in every way for a woman to live this kind of secret life. But I was really compelled by the idea of writing about a woman with a secret life and 2 families, 2 husbands. But at the time, it didn't seem to fit into the collection I was working on. So I sort of, put it on the back burner. And it sat there for, sort of 6 years, I guess, before I started working on it. And then at that point, at the time, I already had the idea of doing kind of this, of having a journalist be telling the story. So then it became about, asking, well, when does the double life take place? What role does the journalist play in the upending of this story? How do they play off each other? Where does it take place? And then answering all those questions kind of helped to bring both characters and time periods to life.
Sure. So one of the things I really enjoyed in the story probably because I'm from Texas, right? And I live in Austin. I grew up in San Antonio. As you mentioning things like HEB in the story, and then there being the mix of English and Spanish. Some people call it Spanglish.
Mhm.
And one thing that I found really fascinating, though, is that you didn't really put a lot of effort into translating the Spanish. It was just
Mhm.
very natural that they talk this way. And so, as growing up in Texas, it's very natural for me to hear that. But I was wondering in the development process if the editors or your publisher had any issue with some of these kind of Texas centric uh, things that you had in your story, which I'm sure people in Texas are going to love, but maybe
Mhm.
mysterious to other folks outside of Texas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. No, my editors actually loved all of the very the specificity of place. They never tried to sort of make it more general. They never asked me to translate the Spanish. Everybody I think really understood why I didn't,
Right.
which was, I've talked in several interviews about the fact that, growing up in Laredo, which was, 99% Mexican when I was growing up, and I read one book by a Latina author that entire time, so my first 17 years. And the only book I read by a Latina author was in seventh grade, The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros.
Mm-hmm.
And I read a lot, I read hundreds of books a year ever since I was a kid. And so to think that I spent my entire life and that was the only access that I ever had to essentially kind of a non-white book. Like it wasn't until I was in college or even really grad school, I think, that I realized how predominantly white my literary exposure
Right.
was, both to, I guess, sort of like the classic Western canon, but then also contemporary fiction. And I didn't look critically at what a problem that was until I think I was in sort of my early to mid 20s. And then it became very as I started reading particularly women of color in my grad school program, and that really opened the doors for me as far as showing what it could look like to represent your community, right, your slice of the world in a very unapologetic, specific way, which I think, as a young writer, I always shied away from, because South Texas is a very specific place, as you're mentioning. And so when I was a young writer in my teens and early 20s, it sort of felt like I had to, not give characters last names and put them in these big cities that I'd never even been to, because that would be what a general reader would
Right.
recognize or wanted. And yeah, and it wasn't until I was sort of in my mid 20s that I realized, like, oh, I'm thinking that a general reader is a white reader. That's a euphemism.
So some of the other writing that you do besides fiction is some journalistic pieces. And I saw recently that you had written an article about being a mother and a writer, being a parent and a writer. And I'm from a generation of men that likes being a parent. Know a lot of
Mhm.
men who were stay-at-home dads. And so I actually, believe it or not, related a lot to your article, because when my kids were small, my sleep cycle was messed up for a couple years because, and they never slept on regular periods. And then I actually didn't write very much.
Mhm.
And I found it fascinating that you were writing part of this draft while you were pregnant, and then you stopped for a long period of time, and then you picked it up again. Talk about that period where you weren't writing. And before you do that, let me just say that there was a time when I was writing a book and my grandmother died, and I didn't write for 9 months. There was like this break in that draft period. And
Mhm.
although it's a different type of break, it was interesting picking it back up, because my initial fear was it's never going to be the same. But it was
Mhm.
really interesting how fast I went, oh, yeah, I did that. And my brain just kind of snapped back in. So can you
Mhm.
talk about that period where you weren't writing?
Sure. Yeah. I started the draft in August of 2017, and that was right after I found out I was pregnant with my first daughter. And I probably got through about 200 or 250 pages of the first draft by the time I was 6 or 7 months pregnant. But the pregnancy was very painful. And so at that point, there was just really nothing else I could think about except how uncomfortable, how in pain I was. And so I stopped writing at that point. And then after I had my daughter, it was probably 4 or 5 months before she started napping. She wasn't sleeping well at night during that time period. So, I was just a mess, like just constantly. I remember at one point changing her diaper, and she pooped in the middle of the diaper change, and I just lost it. Like I just
Yeah.
like just completely, it was as if somebody had died.
Right.
I was so threadbare on the ability to really adapt to anything, on that, when you go for that long with that little sleep or in that much discomfort, you're just not yourself. And part of that for me was that, that sense of not having the focus to write, but also very much not having the time to write. And yet at the same time, there were moments where I would be sitting there with her, at night, nursing her or whatever, trying to get her back to sleep, and it would be quiet. And I could just I could feel the words, and I could feel how much I had in me that I wanted and needed to get back to. And I was dying to get back to it. And I remember sort of at the 4-month mark, crying at the kitchen table to my husband and saying, I'm not writing. What if I never write again? What if she never sleeps? What if this is it? What if my chance to be a writer was before I had kids and I never even finished this book? And so thankfully she started napping, and that became my work time. Was every time she would nap, I would sit down to work. It didn't matter how tired I was, didn't matter what else needed to get done. Her nap time had to be my work time. And so that was how I, wrote the first, that's really how I've written ever since, is during the kids' nap times. And then when my husband, who is amazing and, such an equal co-parent, when he has them as well, I'm able to work. But yeah, it's really transitioning to a whole new mode of working. It's so different from when you have all the time in the world, to sit down and, get everything ready and, try to get to a place of inspiration. Whereas, when you're on this time limit, but you don't know what the limit is, it could be 20 minutes, could be an hour and a half. Yeah, you just have to kind of sit down and turn it on and do it. And it might not always be good, but just being able to, I think for me, it was always, if I can get to my desk and if I can sit down, I'll be okay, because I'll do something, right? But if I were to go do anything else, if I were to sit down at the dining room table, if I were to go, lie down on my bed for just a few minutes, that it would be over. I always knew that when I put them to sleep, I have to go to my desk first thing, or else I'm going to lose my chance. And so, yeah, that's how I wrote the book and edited it. And obviously during the pandemic as well. And one child became 2 children, and yeah.
Right. Yeah, I related to that article. The equivalent for your early motherhood days was my day job, right? And I learned that I could write on my lunch breaks. And a lot of people thought, well, you can't really get anything done. But there were times where I would write 1,200 words in an hour.
Yeah.
If I had a plan for what I was doing. And I got in this routine of that's when I write. I go for a quick walk. I ruminate about what I'm going to write about from the day before, get to my desk, eat a sandwich, and I'd put some music on, and bam, it was like I went into a trance.
Yeah.
Right? Which is that making yourself get in the zone, right?
Yeah.
Even if it's just for a short period and if you just write 400 or 500 words, that's all you need, because you have cumulative progress over time. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think also, what you mentioned about you going on the walk and ruminating, I would take my son for probably his first 16 months or so. We would go for a walk every single day at 5, because he would just turn into a night. He's a very happy, easygoing baby most of the time, but 5 o'clock would hit and it was just nightmare. So I would take him for a walk, and that would become sort of my ruminating time of thinking, okay, where am I in the story? What edits do I want to make? What am I wanting to do the next time I sit down? And I would do that as well, when I would nurse both of them at night. It would be those really quiet nighttime hours, and you're sort of in between, you're not fully awake, but you're definitely not asleep. And I always felt actually very creative at that time. And so I would just really let myself sort of daydream-ish about the story and the characters, and that I always felt like that gave me a head start when it came to sitting down at the desk the next day. So that's a really good point.
So I saw recently that you were at the San Antonio Book Festival, and they had a big blown up poster of your cover, right?
Yeah.
And this is your hometown. And so I imagine that experience must have either been, there was a lot of elation, or there was a lot of terror. I'm not really sure which one it was for you. But, when you write something for so long, and then you go into this other mode, which is completely different than the solitary writer life. What was that like for you? Did you feel elation, or was there terror, or was there a mix of both? How was that?
I think definitely seeing the big blown up book poster was just this like surreal, giddy moment. It still feels surreal to even, think that I have a book coming out tomorrow and that they blew it up into a massive poster at the book festival. I think that I get very nervous before, each interview and event that I've done. There's a lot of sort of like anticipatory anxiety leading up to it. But once I'm in each conversation like this one, I feel very energized by them, and I feel like it is it's such a gift, to be able to talk to people who have read this book that I worked on for so long and who have connected with different aspects of it enough to, want to spend an hour of the day talking about it. That's
Right.
I mean, that is something that kind of makes me want to cry just talking about, because that it's a kind of, connection that doesn't exist when it is just you and the work. And so that's something that I'm really appreciating about this time period, is being able to connect with other people about whatever it is that connected with them in the book. And that feels really magical to me. And at the same time, I really miss the quiet of, just being able to sit and dream and write. And I'm really looking forward to, being able to get back to that place too.
Right. It's definitely a different part of your brain, that you have to turn on.
Yeah, like I don't feel right now, sort of in the middle of all of this, I don't feel like I could be creative in that way. Like it's, I've been writing a lot of essays, but to me, it's a different part of the brain.
Yeah.
But I think that I'm probably going to need a little bit of quiet time before I sit down to work on the next book and, essentially kind of try to get rid of the voices in your head. It's such a loud period of time in a lot of ways. And I think that I'll probably need to, I don't know, let myself get back to that quiet space.
Yeah. There's, you're going to have to learn how to disconnect from that, because it's definitely something that can affect you. The last conference, I was invited to the American Library Association Public Librarian Conference that they had it was in Nashville. It was the month before the pandemic started. It was February of 2020. And I was so excited. I went out to that. I flew out. They had a tornado that wrecked downtown. And then right after that, the pandemic started. And I haven't been to a writer's conference since. It's been so long. But, I was looking at the pictures with you and I thought, well, how great, that people are starting to do that again.
Yeah, I remember going to the San Antonio Book Festival years ago. I think maybe my first daughter was like still a baby, I think, when I went. And I just remember going as a reader and an audience member, and a writer who was still working on a draft. Like it felt so energizing just to be able to listen to other writers talk about their work and their process. And so to be able to go this year as a panelist was sort of a bit wild.
I bet.
Yeah, I felt like, I should still be in the audience.
No, Katie, you're supposed to be up there. All right. So what's a book that you've read recently that kind of blew away any expectations you had going into it? That you thought maybe it'd be one thing and then you discovered something else and loved it?
Yeah, it's a book coming out in September by Tracy Lian, and it's called All That's Left Unsaid. And it is about a 17-year-old Vietnamese Australian boy who gets murdered at a restaurant the day of his senior prom. And there are 17 witnesses, but nobody is talking. And so his sister, who's a few years older, and she's moved down from Sydney to Melbourne, goes back up to Sydney to try to figure out how her younger brother, who is sort of this, this A student, this image of perfection, really, how he could have died that way, and why nobody is talking. And so from the premise, it sounds like a sort of a fairly conventional crime novel, but it is the writing is beautiful, and it's mostly told through the perspective of the sister, but we also get the perspectives of, I think, up to maybe 5 or 6 different witnesses. And each witness, and the chapters are longer, so you might have a witness chapter that's like 30 or 40 pages. And they are so intricately and finely drawn. And, the overarching effect is that it's about so much more than this one crime. It's about this Vietnamese refugee community, who has moved to this suburb in Australia that sort of for this period of time in the 90s had a horrible heroin epidemic. And it's about this idea of how this kind of displacement can lead to violence and lead to injustice, and the kind of like folly in thinking that if you do everything right as the child of an immigrant, if you do everything right, then you'll be called one of the lucky ones. You'll have the life that your parents gave up everything to give you. And this idea that you can do all of the right things and still end up like this 17-year-old boy, that there is really this idea of being lucky is sort of faulty all on its own, that the game is sort of rigged. And so it becomes this much larger commentary, and it's so beautifully done, and it blew me away.
Right. Excellent. So the last question, but probably the most important, you're in San Antonio, I'm in Austin. Who has better tacos?
Oh, I gotta say San Antonio, and I lived in Austin for like 10 years.
Very interesting.
I mean, I think the closer to the border you get, and Laredo beats them all, I have to say. But no, San Antonio, and I think it's also, in San Antonio, it's always, I think Austin's the same, but it's always the hole in the wall places, the really modest places that are, the truly Mexican places. No fancy stuff, just a good taco.
Right. Up here in Austin, it's the food trucks. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Up here, the best tacos are on the food trucks.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. So now is the time in the show where we do the lightning round. It's 10 questions. It's a format we stole from inside the Actors Studio, but it's not their format. They stole it from Bernard Pivot, who stole it from Marcel Proust. Katie Gutierrez, are you ready for the lightning round?
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. What is your favorite word?
I really like the word bougainvillea.
What was that one?
Bougainvillea. I mean, I guess I don't know if it's cheating because it's Spanish, I guess, but it's the flower.
Oh, excellent.
I think it's just such a beautiful word to look at. And it's one of those words that to me, when you say it, it sounds like what it is to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. What is your least favorite word?
Like many people, I'm not a fan of the word moist. I think it's one of those words that I think just really
that's
rubs
a
people
recurring
wrong.
one that comes up for sure. What turns you on?
Kindness.
Excellent. What turned you off?
Fox News.
Oh, yeah, I agree. What is your idea of happiness?
A taco, coffee, and book in bed on a Sunday morning that I have not gotten to do in a very long time.
Excellent. Who's your favorite author?
That's really hard. I think for any kind of like mystery or suspense, I think Tana French for me is the queen. Contemporary fiction, I'm such a fan of Jesmyn Ward. I just think everything she does is like beautiful and devastating and brilliant.
Excellent. So if you couldn't be a writer, what profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
I always thought I would like interior design.
Very nice.
Yeah.
What profession would you least want to do?
Anything mechanical, because I would be horrible at it and I would just be swearing all day and I would do everything wrong. Yeah.
Okay. If you could be a character in a well-known novel, who would that be?
I think Bertha in Jane Eyre, but I would, have to break out of that attic a lot sooner, set the house on fire a lot sooner, get Jane on my side, see where the story goes from there.
Right. Okay. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
Welcome. Here's a glass of champagne before you see everybody that you love.
Excellent. Katie Gutierrez, excellent book. More Than You'll Ever Know comes out tomorrow. Thank you for being on our show.
Thank you so much, Scott. This was so much fun.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liti Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review. We're typing "The end is just the beginning." Find out more at blueinkreview.com.